It is indeed an honor to come and celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Southeast Europe Research Centre here in Sheffield. I've been hearing wonderful things about its achievements, and this is to be highly regarded and prized in these difficult times for the region. I'm delighted to give this lecture this evening, and I'd like to give my thanks to my hosts and my best wishes for the future of the centre. As you can see, my topic this evening is the Balkan state tradition and the challenges for Europe. It is a topic which is slightly at the fringe of my comfort zone, as it were. I'm not suggesting my comfort zone is huge necessarily, but this is something of a new topic and a new paper for me, so I very much welcome your feedback and questions at the end. So my focus this evening essentially has two questions. How similar are the Balkan states, and what challenges arise for the European Union from their patterns of domestic governance? I'm going to argue that the Balkan states show much similarity. Indeed, we can suggest that they form something of a distinct world of governance. They're growing more similar amongst themselves and diverging more with the rest of Europe. This, I suggest, has significant implications for the European Union. The European Union has neglected the importance of different governance systems at the national level for many years, both for its existing member states and for those nations seeking to join. Yet in many ways, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that Europe faces today. How can the European Union manage its agenda when its implementation rests so heavily on the will and capabilities of governments domestically, and when that national capacity and performance varies so much? The challenge of this diversity obliges the European Union to rethink its strategy and to consider how it might intervene more effectively at the domestic level where needed. As it does intervene, there are, of course, inherent risks to the EU's own cohesiveness, its credibility, and legitimacy. So I suggest that by examining the case of the states in the Balkans, we can appreciate the vulnerabilities of the EU system more generally. Let me first try to clarify some of the underlying conceptual issues. How am I interpreting the concepts of the state and of the state tradition? Of course, the state is one of the most central debates in political science. What is the state? Is the state the reality behind the mask of everyday political practice, or is there nothing other than the political practice itself? The latter is perhaps more of an Anglo-Saxon instinct. If the state exists, is it an agent or a structure or both? I'm going to argue that the state has both a cultural relevance and an analytical utility. As an analytical concept, I follow the writings of Colin Hay, late of this parish, as it were, in his most recent article, in which he says that the state defines a series of contexts within which agency is both authorized and enacted or institutionalized. Of course, when we talk of the state, we talk of a rather complex and amorphous setting. But like Hay, I'm not suggesting that the state has a singular unity. Indeed, any state only achieves a partial unity. But at the same time, I think we can also acknowledge that the idea of the state is one with a social force as well, especially in continental Europe, and we need to place it in its social context. The state is to some significant degree culturally constructed according to different settings. It has a normative tradition that rests on established legal norms and inherited social images, values, and habits. And this social construction of the state matters. It has consequences for how we are governed. As my former colleague Kenneth Dyson wrote a number of years ago, the state idea is a highly generalizing, integrating, legitimating concept. It distinguishes public power from that of civil society, it depersonalizes state power, and it involves an awareness of the unique and superior nature of the state itself. We think, of course, of the German Rechtsstaat or the French Republican tradition, identifying the distinctiveness of the state and of the citizens' relationship to it. So it's in that sense, I think we can refer to a state tradition. So my question is, what is the nature of the state tradition in the Balkans today? And by examining this question, I think we learn something important about, yes, governability, but we also recognize that it cannot be fully separated from its domestic social context. Now, of course, when we think of the Balkans, we think of a number of connotations of how we stereotype the Balkans, often negative connotations. These images are replete in the literature on the region. In looking at the literature recently, I picked up the following themes. When we think of the Balkans, we think of domestic fragmentation in a political, cultural, and socio-economic sense. We think of deeply destructive and often fratricidal intercommunal conflict. We think of intolerance, clientelism, corruption, stunted civil society, and a weak rule of law. We think of impersonal or oppressive vertical power relations, and we certainly think of widespread feelings of victimization, vindictiveness, and fatalism. So the Balkans present to us a number of negative images, almost a political nightmare, you might think, but certainly for an academic, a worthwhile topic to pursue. Maria Torodova has analyzed these images very well. She says the way that the West has imagined the Balkans over the last century became synonymous with a cultural backwardness. Balkan, Balkanizing, Balkanism, each became terms of political abuse. As she says, Balkanization not only had come to denote the parcelization of large and viable political units, but has also become a synonym for the reversion to the tribal, the backward, the primitive, the barbarian. What has been emphasized about the Balkans, she says, is that its inhabitants do not care to conform to the standards of behavior devised as normative by and for the civilized world. In short, we should take care in understanding the history and the social conditions of the region. The region became increasingly referred to as the Balkans during the period of the Ottoman Empire, and it is with Ottoman rule that it became associated with Orientalism in Western eyes. Voltaire, for example, equated Eastern Orthodoxy and Orientalism. Arnold Toynbee, and more recently Samuel Huntington, also saw fault lines between the region and the rest of Europe. But I think the region has shown too much internal diversity to support these kinds of stereotypes. If, for example, the equation is between Orthodoxy and Orientalism, then Slovenia doesn't quite fit the pattern, having been under the Habsburg rule and its population being Catholic. Similarly, the arguments about a clash of civilizations with the Balkans and the Near East also doesn't really stand up. Catholic Italy displays some similar traits to the region, as do Spain and Portugal. So making general systemic characterizations of these kinds is, I suggest, rather hazardous, far too hazardous for a grey, wet Friday afternoon here in Yorkshire. In any event, I'm going to limit myself to the nature of the state institutions and the systems of governance in the region, rather than characterizing entire political systems. It leads me to consider notions of statehood and state-society relations. Walker Connor once asked a classic question: when is a nation? In the Balkans, I suggest, the answer might be after the state. That is, the new Balkan states of the 19th century had in many ways still to create the nation. A narrative still had to be constructed. And an important steer came with the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which ratified new states on an ethnic basis. This, of course, was then reinforced with the Wilsonian doctrine of self-determination. So my point is, ethnic collectivism became the very basis of the states in the Balkans. And this ethnic consciousness had been cultivated under the influence of the Enlightenment to create imagined communities based on nationalism rather than religion. The Orthodox Church had kept alive a religious identity under the Ottoman Empire, of course, but the Church was soon to be on the defensive in the face of the concepts of national identity and secular states. This was epitomized when Greece's leading Enlightenment thinker, Korais, supported a break between the national church and the Patriarch in Constantinople. Other national churches would soon follow later. The new nationalism led logically to irredentism, to reclaim the nation and expand territory. Then once conquered, in many cases, our language had to be imposed on our people to create the new nation. In consequence, this ethnic stress served to structure norms of rights as collective rights, an interest based on an historic mission. Irredentism also became ethnocratic, with a nationalism based on ethno-symbolic foundations. We can think of a messianic ethnic collectivism, according to Biddle and Jeffries. With statehood occurring pre-nationhood, as it were, with the state before the nation, to put it somewhat crudely, it created the challenges of managing a disjunction or a lack of fit between the prevailing social conditions and the aspirations of state builders. Tsoukalas and others have noted this problem for the birth of the modern Greek state. Liberal ideals were implanted by elites in a largely traditional agrarian society. The consequence of this mismatch has been a distinctive form of pre-modern, illiberal political practices, a rentier state, as economists would call it, with clientelism and corruption, a state with only a small liberal constituency, for example. And with the imposition of statehood, state institutions and administrative culture were hierarchical, possessing a legal formalism and with a strong Napoleonic traits. A similar contrast between liberal norms and a pre-modern illiberal social base was evident in many other Balkan states. In the case of Bulgaria, for example, Marcheva has recently commented that the duality of Eastern versus Western values is found at the core of Bulgarian administrative culture. Now, there are two qualifications we need to make on a historical basis about these patterns: the experience of Islam and the experience of communism. Islam more emphatically privileged religious identity, of course, over those of ethnicity and nationalism. The Ottoman Empire recognized religious faith as the point of separation, with a strict division between Muslims and non-Muslims. Christians and Jews fortunately enjoyed special recognition, but were of an inferior status. As zimmi, they had fewer rights and were governed by different laws. A strict hierarchy gave the Sultan almost unchecked powers. But with the stress on religious identity, the Muslims of the Balkans had a distinctive legacy when it came to statehood. But nevertheless, I think some traits were still shared: the hierarchy of the state, the absence of liberal notions of citizenship, the stress on collective rather than individual identities and rights, the inferior status or suppression of minorities, and the unchecked power of state authority. For its part, the impact of the communist state formation was, of course, far from uniform in the Balkans. General descriptions are hazardous, but to varying degrees, it reinforced the values of hierarchy, administrative formalism, and unchecked power. In the Bulgarian case, for example, Mocheva has commented that state civil servants were virtually executioners of the orders and decrees issued within the uniform command structures for policy implementation and were centrally guided by the Communist Party. The system required iron discipline and loyalty to the Communist Party and to the party functionaries. No values of difference were tolerated. The informal practices and the patterns of corruption were actually intensified. As a result, the public view of the administration became even more cynical in Bulgaria. So again, we can note the relevance of some of the key conditions: the supremacy of the party, its command over public administration, and the contrast between rule formalism and the everyday informal practices and corruption. These are clearly relevant to the theme of enduring elements of an administrative culture. Now, the idea of an administrative culture gets me closer to my main focus. It's helpful here, I think, to deepen our understanding of the state tradition. We think of administrative culture possessing norms, instincts, ways of doing things, as it were. And the descriptions of the individual Balkan states show striking similarity in terms of this core administrative culture for state institutions. Sven Eriksson, sadly not Sven-Göran Eriksson, is a writer and consultant on administrative reform, and he has depicted the Serbian administration as follows. Public administration in Belgrade was, he said, rule-oriented and risk-averse, based on legal formalism that governs all operations. It has a strong centralization of decision-making authority, with weak mechanisms for cross-ministerial coordination. It has a far-reaching politicization involving clientelism and corruption. Staff morale is low. There is a shortage of administrative equipment and infrastructure. A similar picture can be painted elsewhere in the Balkans. For Bulgaria, for example, Mocheva describes the adherence to legal mandates and procedures, the lack of adaptation towards notions of public service, and well short of notions of new public management, the absence of concern for merit and competence, the passive administrator who seeks merely to survive in the system, the lack of accountability, and patterns of corruption. What is significant here, I think, is both the relevance of these features across the Balkans in the present period and also as a long-term historical cultural tendency. They suggest a common path and a shared set of norms of underlying relevance to how the state machine operates, key elements of a frame that has survived regime change and major events over the long term. It's tempting, I think, to equate Balkan state tradition with what Joel McDowell has called the distinction between a weak state and a strong society. By general consent, Balkan states have appeared to have a sham strength, struggling to satisfy his test of being able to, quote, penetrate society, regulate social relationships, extract resources, and appropriate or use resources in determined ways. Now, of course, there are many conceptions we might have of a weak state, but a common emphasis in the literature is of state power in its social context. And in the Balkans, rentier states have been weakened by clientelism and corruption, and McDowell sees social structure also as having an important effect on the administration, the implementation of policy, state capacity is weak. There is also, I think, a parallel with McDowell's notion of external dependency, of the domestic weakness of government institutions in the face of foreign ties and references. So, is there a Balkan state tradition? Not, I suggest, in the conventional sense. We can't speak of a Balkan state tradition as we might speak of a German or French model. Instead, the Balkan societies have imported state models at different historical stages, in 19th century state building, in the communist era, or with moving closer to the European Union. The Balkan state tradition has been more one of emulation, an aspiration of local elites to converge domestic practices with a foreign modernity, a dash to the future, as it were. Beyond this absence of a distinct Balkan state model, we can identify, though, I think, shared Balkan traits in two key dimensions: the state administrative culture and the relations or perceptions wider society has of the state. And we need to keep in mind the critical contrast between the formal and the informal, to distinguish the legal institutional formalism of the state from the socio-cultural norms and practices that actually prevail within it. And the symbiotic link in these norms and practices of wider society, between the state and wider society, one feeding on the other, neither has been created separately. As the literature on quality of governance internationally suggests, there is a symbiotic relationship between the nature of state and society. Now, how similar then are the Balkan states? I'm going to show you on this wonderful screen behind me some international indices that suggest that they are more similar to each other than they are to most others. In other words, there is something of a distinct Balkan group today when it comes to governance. Here we have from the University of Gothenburg and its Institute on the Quality of Governance a score about government quality, impartiality, and corruption. In the red columns, you have consistently the Balkan states. In the blue columns, you have Southern Europe as the contrast. We see on that particular scale something of the commonality, as it were, of the quality of government in the Balkans. There is a pattern in some of the other graphs I'm going to show you. What we have here is a distinctiveness of the Balkan states as a group. If actually I can take your attention off that, I'm not quite ready to show you this stunning, colourful graph. I know it's Friday, but please be patient. In the graphs I'm about to show you, I think there is something of a distinctiveness of the Balkan states plus Italy. And this is largely consistent across a range of sources and measures. Now, the indices I'm about to show you come from the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicators. And each measure is actually a composite. It's a composite of a number of different sources. And the number of sources is something more than 30. So we're not talking about one-off measures here. We're talking about aggregate scales. And consistently, they show us, over time, a distinctive Balkan pattern. They also, in that respect, show that Greece is converging with its Balkan neighbours, and that Turkey is Balkan in these respects as well. It is Balkan, it is Southeast Europe, it is not Southern Europe, because apart from Italy, Spain and Portugal are actually converging with the rest of Europe. And the Balkan group actually shows further convergence over time. So let me satisfy your appetite. This first graph is of government effectiveness from the World Bank. And you can see, although I'm sorry, from that distance, it probably looks like the inside of a computer. Let me tell you what it actually shows. It shows that the bottom lines converging there are the Southeast European countries, and with Italy joining them as well. And they form a distinct group which becomes gradually more convergent and more distinct from the rest of Europe. As I say, Spain and Portugal do not converge, neither do France and Germany in any sense. And this is a perception of the quality of public services, the quality of the civil service, and its political independence, the quality of policy formulation and its implementation, the credibility of the government's commitment to such policies, etc. Let's move on. Another scale, regulatory quality scores. This reflects the perceptions of the ability of government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations that permit and promote private sector development. Again, over something like a 15-16 year period, you have the countries of Southeast Europe gradually converging and diverging from other European states. The rule of law, measures of how well states respect the rule of law, to what extent people have confidence in the state abiding by the rule of law and the rules of society. In particular, the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, the police, the courts, as well as the likelihood of crime and violence. Again, it's the same trend. Southeast Europe is a distinct group, with Greece and Italy converging with them. And by 2012, Southeast Europe is more convergent than it was in the mid-1990s. Control of corruption. Again, it's the perceptions of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain. We know by its nature, when we try to gauge the levels of corruption, we rely on public perceptions of corruption rather than other more objective measures. But the same pattern is even more strikingly shown here with the countries of Southeast Europe, curiously plus Italy, converging increasingly over the 15-16 year period and diverging from the rest of Europe. Finally, the Economist Intelligence Unit has a democracy index about the functioning of government. And although there is some variation, nevertheless, again, the columns in red are the countries of Southeast Europe, and with the exception of Portugal, to the left of the scale, they are the countries of the Balkans. So what can we draw from this data? I suggest that they show that the Balkan states display a very similar set of characteristics with respect to governance. These are measured by public attitudes, by expert surveys, and it seems somewhat consistent with the historical overview I was offering a moment ago. Importantly, the distinctiveness of this group predates the economic crisis, as does Greece's and Italy's convergence with the rest of the Balkans. It isn't a simple matter of the levels of economic development. Italy has converged, for example, but Spain and Portugal have not. Nor can the cohesiveness of the group be easily related to the impact of the European Union. Membership or pre-accession agreements come and go, but the distinctiveness predates the impacts of the European Union. And the graphs show a trend over a 15-year period. It shows some endurance of the themes that I'm raising. And the trends seem to intensify the long-term historical features that I was mentioning a little earlier. Now, why the recent trends strengthen the long-term patterns so markedly is another question in need perhaps of separate consideration. Perhaps it's something of a similar response to shared outside pressures to adapt to the state's economic role. Perhaps it's a response to a common European Union reference frame. But it is, I suggest, as if they're becoming something of a separate world of governance. A separate world of governance. A world of governance that the West has felt the need to take action for. International support to the Balkans, that is, has followed some of these precepts. I came across an article recently on the Balkans entitled "Weak States, Uncivil Societies, and Thousands of International NGOs, Benevolent Colonialism in the Balkans." It highlights, I think, the policy theme of external intervention and the clashes it entails between a foreign agenda of intervention and the domestic receptivity. For the European Union has itself engaged in state building within the region. We can think of the European Union's participation in Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, the so-called protectorates of the Western Balkans, where the European Union started with a peacekeeping role. Or we can think of the EU's actions being so consequential in terms of the international acceptance of Slovenia and Croatia as new states. And again, the EU has been engaged in promoting a democratization process in Serbia and Albania. In addition, the EU is engaged in building new member states, of course, and the accession process is now very involved with whole hosts of the acquis communautaire, some 32 or more different chapters of legislation that applicant states must implement. So the EU is engaged in the Balkans and has been in different ways for a number of years. But what is the EU actually attempting to do in the Balkans? It doesn't seem to have a tremendously clear, certainly not a cumulative policy. In other words, the path towards accession to the European Union seems to be far from a linear or clear one. Neither is it clear that the different speeds of accession for the Balkan states are in any sense directly related to the strength of democratic values held domestically. But the EU is pressing a similar agenda for reform across the Balkan states. The EU publishes progress reports for its pre-accession states in the Balkans. And these progress reports indicate a remarkable uniformity in terms of the agenda that the European Union seeks for the reform of these systems domestically. There's a strong emphasis about the reform of public administration across the Balkan states. I could quote to you from the Serbian progress report, the Albanian, Macedonian, etc., where there is a common theme here of the European Union trying to strengthen the domestic public administration, overcoming ill coordination across government departments, tackling corruption, and trying to emphasize the degree of control and management from the top. Themes recur across these different progress reports. It's emphasized, for example, that in Serbia last year, 60% of those who gained jobs in the public administration did so on the basis of being appointed without competition, without an application being submitted, non-meritocratic, as it were. If you look at the progress reports, the recurring themes of how to emphasize, how to strengthen meritocracy of appointments, how to overcome the ill coordination and the lack of management control from above. There is, in other words, a remarkable consistency in the diagnosis of this lack of control and coordination, but also of the political manipulation of the state's administrative institutions across the Balkans. Now, of course, the Greek crisis has brought the European Union into a whole new different kind of state building. Greece has a troika office permanently, seemingly, in Athens to investigate, monitor, and report to the rest of the European Union. Greece also has an EU task force to offer technical assistance. A while ago, the leader of the left-wing Syriza party labelled the head of the EU task force a pro-consul in Athens. Certainly, the Troika's role appears impositional. With the loans to Greece comes a conditionality which details extensive administrative reforms. Indeed, of all of the reforms that Greece is required to make, some 40% refer to the reform of the public administration. They required the government to create new mechanisms at the top to own and steer the internal reform process, to strengthen the autonomy of key parts of the administration from political manipulation and corruption, to increase the efficiency in budget management and tax revenue, to change personnel policy, a shift towards incentives and performance-related pay, the evaluation of public servants. All of this agenda is, of course, very similar to what I was alluding to in relation to the pre-accession states of Greece's neighbours in the Balkans. The difference is that the agenda for Greece exposes the European Union even more. In other words, what if the European Union actually fails to achieve real reform in Greece? So let me make a number of concluding comments. I try to offer evidence that I think attests to the sense of a distinct world of governance in the Balkans. They are increasingly converging in their performance across indices of the quality of governance, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, democratic practices, across a number of measures over a 15-year period at least. Moreover, the Balkan states are actually diverging further from the rest of the European Union. In that sense, the problem is getting worse. As I've tried to outline, the convergence amongst the Balkan states reflects some shared historical traits. The state tradition is one of emulation of foreign models, but it's also of a misfit with domestic social conditions. The reality is of a weak state and strong society paradox, with a hierarchy, rigidity, and legal formalism in the face of strong social pressures, clientelism, and corruption, with administrations struggling to deliver core functions. That is, states with a modernizing role have themselves been left somewhat unmodern, as it were, by the strength of embedded social conditions. These common features have been built up over a long period and survived major changes of regime. The robustness of the common norms and practices raises the difficult question of whether such states can escape from their past. Bo Rothstein's work on the quality of governance suggests that the spectre that these states face is being caught in something of a social trap. Social conditions such as a lack of trust, corruption, and inequality reinforce one another so that whole systems stabilize in different equilibriums. Some are stuck in vicious circles, others in virtuous circles. The quality of government is thus both a symptom and a cause of wider social traits like the lack of trust and clientelism, etc. There is a parallel here with the writings of people like Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson in the book of a couple of years ago, Why Nations Fail. The endurance of such state features suggests that they approximate to what Ernest Gellner many years ago talked of as segmentary society. That is, of central government being undermined by patronage networks, that the emergence of civil society and the politics of that undermine the emergence of civil society and the politics of the individual. From another point of view, you could see it as akin to a classic collective action problem. Cooperation based on trust would leave everyone better off, but the risks of commitment are prohibitive, so the cooperation doesn't occur. Now, what might the European Union do in this context? The European Union is, I suggest, uncertain in its strategy towards the Balkans. Indeed, it's even contradictory in its accession choices. Certainly, it's unclear about any accession schedule for the future, and the EU's Greek problem looks rather more Balkan than European in type when we place it in a comparative frame. What if we conclude from this evidence that the Balkan states can't reform themselves? Are the cultural constraints too strong for them to escape? We might be back to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis and his implication that we should shun the Balkans. If so, we might ponder the price of the EU doing nothing for the region, for the future of the region itself. But the European Union feels forced to act, and as it does so, it is exposed like never before. Its credibility, reputation, cohesion are at stake. What are the strategic options then for the European Union? It could retreat and withdraw. Now, my presentation should not be seen as an argument for the EU giving up on the Balkans. This would defeat the EU's own interests, interests of peace, stability, and of markets on its doorstep. Let alone would it damage the EU's international prestige. The current position of the European Union being half in and half out of the Balkans, as it were, it's not clear that that serves anyone's best interests, and it's not clear where the strategy is actually heading. In any event, the problem of state dysfunctionality, of state weakness, is already inside the European Union. We saw from the graphs before the poor performances of Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania as member states. This is an agenda that can't be ignored. And the loan conditionality towards Athens will need some kind of ongoing surveillance, whatever happens in terms of the current negotiations with Athens. No one can expect the European Union to walk away from the loans it's given Greece. And all three Balkan EU states, Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania, have also shown problems in their levels of compliance with EU laws. So to repeat, the problem of dysfunctional states is already inside the European Union. Now, the EU has made similar demands for the reform of government administrations across the Balkans and in the context of the bailout of Greece. There is perhaps something of an implicit recognition of a Balkan problem, but as yet there's not a serious or informed debate. To my mind, there is an implicit similarity in the agenda that the EU needs to adopt towards its current member states and that for those states seeking to join it. The EU needs to have a more serious and sensitive debate about how the European Union can better enter the domestic sphere with a long-term strategy for strengthening the quality of government performance. This would likely involve more support, more technical assistance, and more funding. It might involve more sticks, but it certainly should include more carrots. The strategy, in that sense, should be more EU task force than troika, as it were. In other words, the EU needs to deploy more of its strategic resources if it is to achieve anything meaningful, working with domestic coalitions of reformers, empowering reformers and testing their commitments, making them going beyond lip service agreements to achieve real domestic reform. My task this evening hasn't been to search for the solutions, but rather to highlight the diagnosis and the need for a debate. We need to make the dilemmas more explicit. For this is, I think, the biggest challenge the EU faces today: its ability to manage more diversity than it had recognized at a time when it cannot avoid deepening the integration process and making these vulnerabilities more acute. This is true for the Eurozone crisis, for Greece in particular, but also for non-Euro states and pre-accession countries like its Balkan neighbours. As always in the history of the European Union, it's not the economy, stupid, it's the politics. It's the politics that will determine its future viability, and the Balkans today is, again, I think, once again, a test case of Europe's strategy and capability. There are, in short, I think, here, underlying issues that should make us pause about the EU's future path. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Featherstone, for this very analytical, very deep analysis. And as we said, there is time to have questions. So please raise your hand. Who wants to ask? Yes, please.
Yes.
The other factor which you use there is all the external influence which you have on the states, the states do not have what they use. Could I just make a very small point about the EU? The EU, Greece accepted the euro. The euro is a species of world money. Totally unsuited. Now, as you say, the German and French banks, they want their money back, so they drive forward austerity politics in Greece, creates fascism, creates division. And I think Syriza, of course, it's stay in the EU, it's leave Europe. That seems to me kind of odd halfway out.
Thank you for that. There's a number of points to perhaps pick up on. If the intention is to achieve stable long-term growth in some sense of a European modernity of a mixed economy, how then do you strengthen the ability of state institutions to undertake the reforms that seems to come with that paradigm? Domestically, governments historically have been too fragile in periods of the downside of the economic cycle. One way is by an external constraint, such as the euro. And I think I would take a more benign view than the people of Rochester and Stroud last night about the value of the euro for countries, in this case, like Greece, in the sense that recall that what the Eurozone has given Greece is the ability to have very low interest rates, historically low interest rates, on a very long-term basis. The fact that Greece didn't repair the roof when the sun was shining is, of course, partly of the domestic weakness. But what the Eurozone offered were important prizes which domestic institutions, left to their own devices, could not easily attain. On the point about a state system which serves the interests of the ruling class, I think I would go some way towards that in the sense of a more political economy model. Many of these states have a market structure in which there are very few large firms, remarkably few large firms, but an entire myriad of small family micro enterprises. That by itself creates a structure of markets or a structure of firms in the market, which means which favors a kind of incestuous relationship, certainly too close a relationship between state and the very few large company entrepreneurs. In that sense, there isn't a domestic constituency so strongly for the liberal market economics associated with much of the EU's agenda. There isn't a domestic base to argue in terms of flexible, open, competitive markets. Indeed, those with economic power, the few large companies, have an inherent interest in maintaining some barriers to market entry. So I would go with the sense that the state structure is one where it connects with the market being so dominated by a few large firms. And we've seen in each of these countries, if we think of Bulgaria or the Romanian elections or in Greece, in many of the Balkan states, we have a relationship, a political relationship between the few large companies and politicians and parties, which would make Western liberals blush, as it were. So I agree with that, but I think the deeper point is how then you maneuver, how you steer such societies, such economies, towards a broader European agenda of precisely open, competitive markets, how you can find a social base to achieve those things. And one final aspect of that, the irrational can be made rational by the particular social and cultural context. If you have the absence of a welfare state, the weakness of a welfare state, it becomes rational for unions and workers to protect public sector jobs. But it is precisely in this bloated public sector that reform needs to take place. So you have a constituency which is rationally defending their jobs against cost-cutting and against structural reform, which is in some sense against the overall public good, but it is in the context where there is very little other social compensation. The irrational becomes rational in that context. So I think I've gone some distance towards what you were saying. Thank you.
Another question? Anybody else? I have a question, but I want to do it. I don't want to do it before I give the opportunity to anybody else to ask. Okay. Okay, can I ask? Thank you very much. Oops. I dropped something here, sorry. So, I would tend to agree with you when you said that Greece and the rest of the Balkans need more task force and less troika, and that would be great. The thing is that I remember, and I have a little bit of experience, and I think a lot of us have experience, of what happened, for example, in Bulgaria and Romania before they entered the EU. I'm not that old to remember what happened in Greece before we entered the EU. But there was no task force, but there were thousands and thousands of people offering technical assistance. And we kind of know that this was probably didn't work at all. So I don't have, of course, an answer to that, but I wonder how can we do it differently and achieve some results in the next countries?
Well, certainly in the perhaps more extreme case of Greece, the reason why advisedly I'd said more task force than troika, and let's be clear what the contrast is. There's a task force from the EU Commission providing technical support. The troika is the body supervising the loan, and the troika is the body that goes in and sees ministers and says, this is the reform we would like you to implement. No, this is the reform we would like you to implement, as it were. And certainly, we were talking before, until last December, I was a member of the National Research Council in Greece, and I'm certainly conscious of the Troika coming in to ministers and saying that reforms must be done in the very short term. The difference is that when the Troika insists on that kind of short-term reform, it's encouraging a short-term improvisation, a quick fix, rather than a more considered review and an assessment of long-term needs, as it were. So if the problem in Greece is of people focusing on the difficult short-term measures and not a long-term vision of where Greece wishes to be in 10 years' time, then I think it is a direct consequence of the mechanism of the Troika coming in and saying we want these cost-cutting measures to be done now, and the inability to reflect a wider assessment. More task force, more an EU Commission task force, in the sense that there is much scope to upgrade the skills, the technical know-how for how core functions could be performed much more efficiently in the Greek context. Certainly, there is much bilateral technical assistance to Greece, but what I'm suggesting is that is actually likely to achieve more lasting results than the Troika coming in and saying, we'd like this to be done in such a desperately short period of time. In other words, I think there is almost a self-defeating risk here. As the Troika comes in and says we'd like short-term reforms to be implemented, it's actually undermining a debate about serious long-term reshaping of the Greek political landscape or institutions. It's having the worst of all worlds by emphasizing the crudity, the vulgarity of immediate austerity, rather than a debate about reshaping institutions to become more effective and more efficient. Greece is the extreme case, but it is not unique. And what I'm suggesting in relation to the other Balkan states, the pre-accession states, is that more of that technical assistance of how to enhance the efficiency, the effectiveness of government institutions will be in the interest not only of the region, but of the EU in the longer term. It's in that sense of more task force is needed, more of the carrots of change, more of the enhancing of the basic infrastructure. But we've got into this problem by an accession strategy which seems to be inconsistent. We've allowed Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia in, as it were, and then we complain about problems of corruption and politicization of public administration. The strategy has hardly been rational or consistent. We bring member states in and then wonder about the heterogeneity and the management of diversity of the European Union. What we need, I think, is a more rational and, yes, perhaps a longer-term strategy for achieving mutual gains.
Okay, last chance. Any other questions? Professor Crook.
I hesitate to ask a question because it's not my field, but first of all, thank you for the lecture.
Okay.
All strikes me that where we have effective nation states, they take an centuries to evolve.
Mm.
What strikes me is we've got a speeding up the process in those from the European Union. To what extent can you see signs of accountability, i.e. those small firms seeking better rule of law, rule of debt market exchange, people seeking their politicians to be accountable? Can you see that transition taking the years it's taken in our country, in Germany, in the USA? Or can external agencies speed up? There's a kind of model here, the model we should aspire to. Or would
Thank you. It's an excellent question. Reasons to be cheerful, as it were, at the end of a Friday afternoon. I'm not sure that I'm going to really lift your spirits that much in that respect. There is some evidence of, at a time of backlash against the political elite, the failure of our politicians, there is some evidence of urging a more meritocratic, a more responsive public administration. In more recent times, more effective reforms have actually been implemented in the Greek case. But you're right, it's something which is necessarily going to be in the long term. I think what we have is a kind of disparity of the different plates, as it were. At this level, we have some emergence of a new political voice in the party system, but a new political voice more generally in terms of reform of state-economy relations, consistent with a European paradigm. But then at this level, we have something which is conflicting in the sense of saying we want the fiscal adjustments now, and we want the fiscal rebalancing in such a short-term fashion, which actually disempowers those who seek the more deeper, longer-term structural reform. The temporal question, I think you are right in pointing to the fact that the strategy for the Balkans should be long-term and gradual. The problem, however, is that life isn't so simple, because we've invited some of the countries in already. So the problem is inside the European Union, and it's dealing with those kinds of disparities. But yes, rationality would suggest a longer-term process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to call to stand Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul White, to close this ceremony. Thank you very much.
It falls to me to thank Professor Featherstone for what I think was a tremendous lecture that fitted the purpose of the evening incredibly well. And I think what he's done is given us a bit of a research agenda for SEERC for the next 10 years. If not longer, in fact. We've just heard about the short term and the long term. It seems to me that there are a lot of points that have come out of that that really will resonate with everybody in this room that's got an interest in the wider Balkan area, or has been working and thinking about particular issues of politics, social development, cultural development, history, and so on. It's a very broad-ranging view that he's given us. I think it's been really interesting to see the use of some empirical data on the way in which Balkan states are now showing great similarity. That increasing convergence shown through material that relates to governance structures, to perceptions of governance, has been, I think, very stimulating and very interesting. I think issues that he's touched on in relation to the ethnicity and the relationship between ethnic, the state, and the nation, and the ordering there has given us again some food for thought in those areas, particularly in the way in which he's then talked about cultural conditions that are working in various ways to influence what goes on within those various states. So I think it's been a tour de force for us. I think everybody will take various things away. Certainly one thing I'll take away is that as a geographer, I noticed that his map, of course, had 13 states mentioned on there. But I noticed there's a 14th, really, that we ought to regard as a Balkan state now, and that's Italy. It does seem to me that that's quite an interesting conclusion that comes out of what has been said, so thank you for that. This has been a SEERC lecture. It has been something that, as Professor Payne said at the very beginning, is celebrating 10 years. And as I've already said, I think there are research agendas in the material that Professor Featherstone's given us, and in other things that colleagues in this room are thinking about, that will actually keep the work of SEERC going on for a lot longer. And I invite you actually to discuss that and think further about it with a reception that will take place shortly at the back of the room. So thank you again, Professor Featherstone, and I hope everyone will join me in that final round of applause for him and then enjoy the rest of the reception.